The skyscraper of Drew and Coleman Associates towered over the city like a monument to ambition. Inside, everything moved at a feverish pace, heels clattering against marble floors, phones ringing in rapid bursts, the endless shuffle of files, the hum of printers spitting contracts into neat stacks. The young lawyers darted between conference rooms like soldiers preparing for battle. For them, the firm was a temple of power, a battlefield of reputation, a factory where prestige was manufactured. But amid the chaos, there was a figure most people didn't even notice. Walter Hayes. At 68, Walter pushed a squeaky cleaning cart down the gleaming corridor. His back was slightly bent, his uniform a faded shade of blue, his cap pulled low over thinning gray hair. The rubber gloves on his hands were stiff with detergent stains, and every step he took echoed with the quiet rhythm of someone who had been here for years, yet belonged nowhere. People brushed past him without a glance. To them, he was just part of the building, like the potted plants or the flickering fluorescent lights. At best, invisible. At worst, the butt of a cruel joke. "Careful not to slip, Grandpa," a young associate shouted as Walter mopped near the elevators, sending his friends into fits of laughter. Walter didn't respond. He pressed the mop to the marble, his face calm, his eyes lowered, a faint smile tugging at his lips. But there was one man who never missed a chance to humiliate him. Ethan Coleman. 32. Expensive suit, slick hair, sharp grin. His voice always loud enough to dominate a room. He strutted around the office like he owned it, but everyone knew he was just riding the coattails of his family name. And to Coleman, Walter was more than invisible, he was a prop, an easy target to inflate his own ego. "Hayes." Coleman's voice cracked through the corridor like a whip. He emerged from his office holding a half-empty coffee cup. "My office smells like mildew. Get in there. And for God's sake, try to look useful for once." A ripple of chuckles ran through the hallway. A few lawyers smirked, others looked away, pretending they hadn't heard. Walter simply nodded and pushed his cart into the office. Inside, Coleman leaned against his desk, arms crossed, watching as Walter wiped down the shelves. "You should have retired years ago," he muttered in a voice meant only for Walter. "But I suppose no one else would hire you, would they?" Pathetic. Walter's eyes glimmered for the briefest moment, something sharp behind them, but he said nothing. He kept working. Across the hall, Leah, a young intern in her first year, observed through the glass. There was something about the old janitor that unsettled her. His silence didn't feel like weakness. It felt deliberate. Like a man carrying a secret. Later that day, in the cafeteria, the TV played a heated legal debate. Two commentators argued about precedents, their voices filling the room. Walter entered to collect trays and sweep crumbs. As he passed the TV, he quietly murmured the missing clause one of the commentators had forgotten to cite. Word for word. Leah froze. "Wait, what did you just say?" Walter paused for a heartbeat, his expression unreadable. Then he offered the faintest of smiles. "Old habits," he said softly, before carrying the trays away. Her brow furrowed. That wasn't the kind of answer a janitor gave. At that moment, Coleman barged into the cafeteria, laughing loudly with two associates. Spotting Walter, he deliberately tipped his coffee cup, spilling it across the tiles. "Oops," he said with mock innocence, shoving the empty cup into Walter's hands. "Guess you've got work to do." Walter bent down, wiped the floor, and said nothing. Coleman smirked and strutted off. But for the first time that day, Walter allowed his smile to fade. Because nobody in that firm knew the truth. Before the mop, there had been gavels. Before the faded uniform, there had been finely tailored suits. Before the silence, there had been applause in packed courtrooms. Once, Walter Hayes had been a giant. A trial lawyer whose name carried weight in every courthouse in the state. A man whose arguments shaped verdicts, whose voice commanded respect. But giants can fall. And Walter had chosen to disappear into the shadows. What no one knew was that shadows don't last forever. Sooner or later, the light finds its way back. And for Drew and Coleman Associates, that day was coming faster than they could imagine. The city never really sleeps, but the courthouse has its own rhythm. In the late 70s and 80s, when the hallways still smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and old wood polish, one name began to ripple through its chambers: Walter E. Hayes. Back then, Walter was a different man. His back was straight, his stride confident, his voice deep and commanding. He didn't just walk into a courtroom, he filled it. His presence was magnetic, the kind of presence that made jurors sit up straighter, made opposing counsel shuffle their notes nervously, made judges lean forward with raised brows. In his early career, Walter had cut his teeth on small cases, petty thefts, disputes between neighbors, but it wasn't long before his reputation began to grow. He had a gift for words, but more than that, he had a gift for people. He could look at a jury and know, instinctively, which heartstrings to pull. He could cross-examine a witness with such precision that the truth seemed to unravel in his hands. His colleagues remembered him not as loud or flamboyant, but as steady. Unshakable. The kind of lawyer you wanted on your side because he never flinched, never cracked, never lost sight of the person whose life was on the line. There was a night in 1985 when Walter defended a factory worker accused of negligence after an accident killed 2 colleagues. The prosecution painted him as reckless, careless, guilty. Walter painted him as human, a man trapped by faulty machinery and corporate greed. His closing argument was so impassioned that the courtroom fell into a silence so heavy, people swore they could hear their own heartbeats. When the jury returned with a verdict of not guilty, the gallery erupted in cheers. Walter didn't smile or pump his fist. He simply placed a hand on his client's shoulder and whispered, "You can breathe now." It was moments like that which built his legend. But even legends are made of flesh. And flesh can break. Behind the triumphs, behind the sharp suits and the celebrated victories, Walter's world was slowly collapsing. His wife, Anna, had always been his anchor. She was grace itself, soft-spoken, gentle, with a smile that could quiet his storms. They had met in college, when Walter was still a broke law student working nights at a library. She believed in him before he had ever won a single case. They built a life together, modest but warm. For years, Anna was there in the gallery, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes shining with pride as Walter spoke. She was the one who reminded him that law wasn't about winning, but about justice. She kept him human. Then came the diagnosis. It was whispered first, almost like a rumor: leukemia. By the time it was confirmed, Anna's health was already faltering. Treatments were grueling. The woman who once glowed with quiet strength became frail, her skin pale, her body too weak for the simple things she once loved. Walter began leaving the courthouse later and later, rushing home not to celebrate victories but to sit by her bedside. He tried to balance both worlds, the fiery, demanding courtroom and the quiet, suffocating hospital room, but the strain showed. His arguments grew shorter. His eyes grew darker. Once, in the middle of a high-profile trial, he lost his train of thought. Colleagues whispered. Opponents smirked. For the first time, Walter Hayes looked tired. Human. Breakable. One evening, Anna squeezed his hand, her voice a faint whisper. "Walter, promise me something." "Anything," he said, his voice cracking. "When the time comes, don't bury yourself in work. Don't let the law swallow what's left of you. Live. Even if it means letting go." He shook his head fiercely. "I can't let go. You're my reason." But Anna only smiled, that soft, gentle smile that had carried him through decades. "Then find a new reason. When I'm gone, don't stay in court for me. Find peace." Weeks later, she was gone. The courtroom had lost its color. The victories no longer mattered. The applause sounded hollow, like echoes in an empty cathedral. For Walter, every gavel strike was a reminder of the silence waiting at home. One morning, instead of putting on his crisp navy suit, he put on an old pair of jeans. He drove to the firm he had helped build, walked into his office, and handed in his resignation. Colleagues begged him to stay. Judges sent him letters. Even newspapers wrote bewildered op-eds. Why would Hayes step away at the height of his power? But Walter didn't answer. He disappeared. When he resurfaced, it was in the least likely of places. A maintenance job. A janitor's uniform. A cart with mop and rags. At first, people thought it was a joke. The great Walter Hayes, pushing a broom. But soon the whispers faded. Years passed. And the legend was forgotten. Only Walter remembered. Every night, when the firm emptied and the echo of laughter died, he would sit alone in the supply closet with an old notebook. Inside were scraps of his past, case notes, precedents, fragments of arguments he had once made. He would run his fingers over the faded ink, whispering the words to himself like prayers. It wasn't pride that kept him holding on. It was memory. A way to prove, if only to himself, that he hadn't always been invisible. Yet as he pushed that squeaky cart down the marble halls of Drew and Coleman, no one had any idea who he once was. No one, except Walter. And soon, very soon, they would all find out. If Walter Hayes was invisible in the halls of Drew and Coleman, then Ethan Coleman was the opposite. Everywhere he walked, people noticed. He made sure of it. At 32, Coleman carried himself like a man who already believed he was destined to run the firm. His suits were always tailored, his shoes polished to mirror shine, his hair slicked back with the precision of a man who checked his reflection more often than he checked his case files. He had a talent for filling a room with his voice, and an even greater talent for making sure everyone else's voice was drowned out. Colleagues called him charismatic. Some called him confident. But beneath the glossy exterior was something darker, arrogance sharpened into cruelty, and ambition fed by disdain for anyone he deemed beneath him. And for Coleman, few were lower than the janitor. Walter was his favorite target. One Tuesday morning, the corridors buzzed with associates rushing to prepare for depositions. Coleman emerged from his office, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. Spotting Walter polishing the brass handles of the boardroom door, he slowed his pace and smirked. "Careful with that rag, Hayes," Coleman said loudly, ensuring the interns nearby heard. "If those handles don't shine enough, the clients might think you're in charge." The interns chuckled nervously. Walter didn't respond. He simply dipped the rag back into the polish and continued his work, his silence like a stone thrown into a pond that refused to ripple. Coleman hated that silence. It wasn't the silence of fear. It wasn't the silence of submission. It was steady, controlled. And it infuriated him. Later that day, in the cafeteria, Coleman made another show. He sat at the center table with two junior associates, retelling the story of a trial he had dominated, exaggerating every detail. His laughter echoed, his gestures grand. When Walter passed by with his cart, Coleman snapped his fingers. "Hey, mop man. Spill over here." He pointed to a spot on the floor that was already clean. Walter looked at the floor, then at Coleman, and without a word, bent down to wipe it again. Coleman leaned back, grinning. "See that? Obedience. If only juries were that easy." The room erupted in forced laughter. Not everyone found it funny, but no one wanted to risk Coleman's scorn. Except Leah. From her table in the corner, she watched, her jaw tight. She saw the way Walter's hands moved, not clumsy or weak, but precise. Steady. She saw the way he absorbed Coleman's cruelty without breaking. And she saw the way Coleman thrived on it, feeding his own ego at Walter's expense. Something about it disturbed her. Coleman wasn't just cruel. He was strategic. He chose targets carefully: Walter, the janitor who couldn't fight back; Leah, the intern who had no power. He mocked them openly, not only to belittle them, but to remind everyone else where the lines of power were drawn. And in a firm like Drew and Coleman, power was everything. In meetings, Coleman cut people off mid-sentence. In court prep, he stole credit for research he hadn't done. When cases went well, he claimed them as his triumphs. When they faltered, he pointed fingers at junior associates. His charm with clients was undeniable, but those inside the firm began to notice the cracks. One evening, Leah stayed late, organizing files. She overheard Coleman in his office, laughing on the phone. "Of course I'll take the lead," he said. "Drew's too old-fashioned to see it, but soon enough, this firm will be mine. All I have to do is keep making him look slow and out of touch." "Easy." Leah froze in the hallway. His voice was dripping with ambition, but also venom. He wasn't just climbing the ladder, he was planning to push people off it. Then his tone shifted. "And don't worry about that janitor. He's harmless. A fossil. Honestly, it's fun watching him shuffle around like he owns the place. Sometimes I wonder if he even remembers his own name." The person on the other end laughed. Coleman joined in, his laughter echoing down the hall. Leah's stomach turned. The next morning, Coleman walked into the office like a conquering hero. He barked orders, tossed files on desks, and made a spectacle of correcting a junior associate in front of the entire team. His voice cut like a knife. "Details matter," he snapped. "Miss one precedent, and you cost us millions. You want to be remembered as the idiot who lost a client's fortune? Because that's where you're heading." The associate flushed red, muttering an apology. Coleman smirked, satisfied. Meanwhile, Walter polished the glass doors nearby. He said nothing, but his ears caught every word. Coleman glanced at him. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Something flickered in Walter's gaze, steady, unwavering, almost knowing. Coleman's grin faltered. Then he scoffed and turned away. "Pathetic," he muttered under his breath. What Coleman didn't realize was that his cruelty was building pressure. Pressure that would eventually burst. Because Walter Hayes wasn't just a janitor. And Leah wasn't just an intern. And Coleman's arrogance was leading him straight into a trap of his own making. The week of the Henderson vs. Baratek case prep was chaos. The firm pulsed like a living machine, every associate grinding gears, every intern fetching documents as if their lives depended on it. Case files piled high, conference rooms overflowed with charts and exhibits, and the air buzzed with the nervous energy of people chasing millions. Walter moved quietly through it all, pushing his cart between the frenzy. To most, he was just background noise. To Leah, he was something else entirely. It started with the smallest of things. Late one night, Leah was hunched over a desk, highlighters scattered, eyes blurry from hours of research. She groaned as she tried to recall a precedent. "Morgan vs. State Line," she muttered, frustrated. 1990-something. "I can't." From across the room, a voice answered softly. 1993, page 214. Chevron deference applies. She turned sharply. Walter was standing by the copy machine, emptying a recycling bin. He didn't look up, didn't even break stride. He just spoke as though reciting the weather. Leah blinked. "Wait, what did you just say?" Walter glanced over. For a fraction of a second, his eyes softened. Then he shrugged. "Old habits," he said, before slipping out with the trash. Leah sat frozen. No janitor recited page numbers from memory. No janitor casually referenced Chevron deference. Her instincts screamed that she had just glimpsed something important, something hidden beneath layers of silence. But who would believe her? She was just an intern. The next morning, Coleman strode through the office like a parade marshal. His voice boomed across the bullpen as he announced updates on the Henderson case. He waved his arms, pacing like a general before battle. "This is my case," he declared, his tone dripping with pride. "We win this, the firm wins millions. I want no mistakes, no excuses." He spotted Walter quietly cleaning a coffee spill near the back. A grin spread across his face. "And that goes for everyone. Even the janitor," Coleman sneered, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "Hayes, don't screw up the floors, or maybe our clients will sue us for negligence." A ripple of laughter. Forced. Uneasy. Walter didn't respond. He dabbed the spill, wrung the rag, and moved on. But Leah noticed something others didn't. She noticed how Coleman always turned his cruelty into performance. It wasn't just about belittling Walter, it was about cementing himself as untouchable. By mocking the lowest man in the room, he sent a message: "If I can destroy him, I can destroy anyone." Later that day, Leah found herself carrying boxes of exhibits. Her arms shook, knees buckling under the weight. "Need help?" a voice asked. She looked up. Walter was there. His hands, though aged and calloused, moved with surprising steadiness as he lifted half the stack. "Thank you," she said, breathless. Walter gave a small nod. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he looked down at the top file. "Barateka's safety protocols, these are outdated. They won't hold up in cross-examination." Leah froze. How do you know that?" He caught himself, straightened, and placed the box back in her arms. His face returned to its usual mask of calm. "Just looks that way," he murmured, walking off. Her heart pounded. She wanted to chase him, to ask questions. But fear held her back. That evening, Leah overheard Coleman whispering to another associate. His tone was sharp, mocking. "That intern, Leah. She's getting too curious. And the janitor? Don't get me started. Pathetic old man thinks silence makes him mysterious. I might have to remind them both where they stand." The associate laughed nervously, but Coleman's eyes were cold. Over the next few days, Walter became increasingly aware of Coleman's gaze. Whenever he passed by, Coleman's eyes lingered, studying him, as if he suspected something. The ridicule became sharper, more personal. "Hayes, you miss a spot. Figures. Can't even clean right. Maybe I should put you in charge of the Henderson case, at least then I'll know for sure we'll lose." This time, Walter paused. He looked at Coleman directly, his eyes steady, unflinching. For a heartbeat, the younger man faltered. His grin wavered. Then, recovering, he barked out a laugh and turned away. But Leah saw the exchange. She saw Coleman's momentary unease, and she saw the flicker of fire in Walter's gaze. The cracks were forming. Coleman thought Walter was just a prop to mock. Leah suspected he was something more. And Walter? He knew the storm was coming. The tension in the firm thickened as the Henderson case loomed. Associates barely slept. Drew, the senior partner, prowled the halls with bloodshot eyes, barking instructions. Leah spent nights hunched over case law until her hands cramped from scribbling notes. And Coleman? Coleman basked in it. Every moment of chaos was an opportunity for him to strut, to preen, to remind everyone he was the man leading the charge. He wore his arrogance like armor, brushing off corrections, silencing dissent, laughing louder than anyone else in the room. But behind the grin, something darker stirred. Coleman had noticed Leah's eyes drifting too often toward Walter. He had noticed the strange way the janitor sometimes glanced at files, or spoke with quiet precision about things he shouldn't know. And though Coleman laughed it off in public, in private it gnawed at him. He couldn't explain it. He only knew one thing: he didn't like it. And Coleman's instinct, whenever he felt threatened, was to destroy. The trap was set on a Thursday morning. The firm buzzed like a hornet's nest. Phones ringing, printers clattering, the air electric with tension. Coleman stormed down the hall, his laptop tucked under his arm, muttering about a critical brief he had drafted. By noon, panic spread. "Where's Coleman's laptop?" a secretary whispered, her voice sharp with urgency. "He had it this morning," another replied. "Now it's gone." The rumor moved like wildfire. A laptop wasn't just hardware, it was lifeblood. Inside were sensitive files, client strategies, confidential notes. If it was lost, or worse, stolen, the fallout could be catastrophic. Coleman made his entrance into the chaos with theatrical fury. His face was red, his voice booming. "My laptop," he roared. "Someone stole it from my office." Gasps rippled through the bullpen. Associates exchanged uneasy glances. Drew emerged from his corner, his voice tight. "Are you sure it wasn't misplaced?" "Misplaced?" Coleman thundered. "With the Henderson files inside?" "This isn't a coffee mug, Drew. This is sabotage." Eyes darted nervously around the room. And then Coleman's gaze landed on Walter. The janitor stood near the supply closet, mop in hand, head slightly bowed as always. Coleman's lips curled into a smile that was anything but kind. "Check the janitor's closet," he said coldly. A murmur of discomfort spread. The security team hesitated. But Coleman's voice cut through their reluctance like a blade. "Do it. Now." The supply closet was small, cramped, smelling of bleach and old wood. Walter stood quietly to the side as the guards rifled through shelves, opened cabinets, and overturned boxes. And then, one of them froze. "Sir, we found something." From behind a stack of detergent bottles, the guard pulled out a sleek black laptop. Coleman's laptop. The room erupted in whispers. Associates peered through the doorway, their faces pale with shock. Leah stood at the back, her hand over her mouth. Coleman stepped forward, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. Well, he said. "Looks like we found our thief." He turned to the crowd, arms outstretched. "I told you. This man is useless. First he wastes our time, now he tries to sabotage our firm." The words cut like knives. Walter, still silent, met Coleman's gaze. His face betrayed nothing, no fear, no anger. Only calm. Coleman leaned closer, lowering his voice so only Walter could hear. "You thought you could embarrass me with your little stares and whispers? You don't belong here. You never did." Walter's eyes flickered, just for a moment, with something sharp. Then he spoke, his voice steady, quiet, but carrying enough weight that those nearby could hear. "Check the cameras." The crowd fell silent. Coleman blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "Check the cameras," Walter repeated. His tone was neither pleading nor defensive. It was matter-of-fact. Like a man inviting truth to step into the light. The next hour was tense. Security pulled footage from the 14th floor, where Coleman's office was located. They played it back for Drew, for the associates, for Coleman himself. The screen showed Coleman walking into his office with the laptop under his arm. Minutes later, he emerged, laptop still in hand. He walked down the hall toward the elevators. Then, nothing. The next camera angle, the one outside the supply closet, was black. Covered. Security froze the image, zooming in on the lens. Stuck to the camera was a square of tape. And in the earlier footage, at the exact moment Coleman walked past the camera, his hand moved upward, casually, deliberately. The tape. The room went cold. Coleman's grin faltered. He stammered, tried to laugh it off. That proves nothing. Hayes could've. But the damage was done. Everyone saw it. Walter's voice cut through the silence. "The truth always leaves a mark," he said softly. Leah felt a chill race down her spine. She looked at Walter, really looked at him, and for the first time she saw not a janitor, but something else. Something deeper. A man who carried power in his silence. Coleman's fury boiled. His mask of charm cracked, and for a moment his eyes burned with raw hatred. This wasn't over. Not for him. And not for Walter Hayes. The morning after the laptop incident, the halls of Drew and Coleman hummed with whispers. Associates gathered in small clusters, voices low, eyes darting toward Walter whenever he passed. Some pitied him, others distrusted him, but all of them wondered the same thing. Who exactly was this man? Coleman strutted around like nothing had happened, but his confidence had cracks now. The video footage hadn't outright condemned him, but it hadn't cleared him either. He brushed it off with bravado, but the laughter didn't come as easily. His jokes about Walter fell flatter than before. Meanwhile, Walter kept to his routine. Mop. Rag. Silent footsteps echoing in marble hallways. If the storm unsettled him, he didn't show it. But his calm only made people whisper louder. Drew, however, wasn't laughing. That night, long after the lights dimmed and the last associates went home, Drew sat alone in his office. A stack of old files lay before him, their manila folders worn thin by time. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, only that something about Walter Hayes gnawed him. He kept seeing the man's eyes. Not the eyes of a thief. Not the eyes of a fool. But eyes that held memory. He pulled out an old case binder. Morgan v. State Line, 1993. It was a case he hadn't thought about in decades, one that had nearly sunk the firm back when he was still a junior partner. They had been outmatched, outspent, and outprepared, until one young lawyer had stood up and turned the tide. Drew flipped through the dusty pages. His own handwriting scrawled in the margins, frantic notes from late nights. And then, in the middle of a carefully written brief, a signature leapt out at him. Walter E. Hayes. Drew froze. His pulse quickened. He flipped another folder. Another case. Different year. Different client. And again, the same name. Walter E. Hayes. One by one, the memories returned. Cases saved at the last moment. Juries swayed by calm but unshakable arguments. Judges nodding in respect. And at the center of it all, the man they had once called the lion of the courtroom. Drew sat back in his chair, stunned. The janitor. The man who mopped their floors. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a joke. He was that Walter Hayes. The next morning, Drew called an emergency partners meeting. Coleman walked in smirking, clearly expecting the conversation to revolve around his missing laptop. But the room had a different energy. Drew placed the old binder on the conference table. Its faded cover looked out of place among the sleek laptops and polished leather portfolios. "Gentlemen, ladies," Drew began, his voice low but steady. "I need you to see something." He opened the binder, flipping to the page with the bold, confident signature. He tapped it with his finger. "Do any of you recognize this name?" A murmur spread. Some shook their heads. A few frowned. "Walter E. Hayes," Drew said. 30 years ago, he saved this firm." The room stilled. "Saved it?" one partner asked. "Yes." Drew's voice gained force. "We were losing Morgan v. State Line. About to collapse under the weight of corporate lawyers twice our size. And then Hayes, this Hayes, stood in front of the judge and dismantled the opposition. Page by page, line by line. He turned a hopeless case into a precedent that still protects our clients today." Gasps. Disbelief. Coleman's face paled. "That can't be right," he snapped. "You're telling me the janitor, our janitor, is that Hayes? That's ridiculous." Drew met his eyes, unflinching. "Ridiculous? Or inconvenient, for you?" Coleman faltered, then forced a laugh. Even if it's true, so what? He washed out. He quit. He's nothing now. But the room wasn't with him. The air had shifted. Respect for Coleman, already fragile, was eroding. Outside the conference room, Leah waited anxiously. She caught a glimpse of the file through the glass, Hayes's name written in bold ink. Her breath caught. She wasn't crazy. The quiet janitor who had whispered precedents, who had lifted boxes with steady hands, who had endured Coleman's cruelty without breaking, was once a giant. When the meeting ended, Drew stepped out and spotted Walter polishing the brass rail near the staircase. "Hayes," he said softly. Walter turned. Drew held up the binder. "Why didn't you tell us?" Walter looked at the file, then back at Drew. His expression was unreadable. "Because you didn't need to know," he said simply. Drew shook his head. "We did. We do. You don't belong behind a mop, Walter." Walter's eyes flickered, the faintest glimmer of pain crossing his face. "Belonging is a funny word. I belonged once. It cost me everything." Before Drew could reply, Walter picked up his cart and wheeled it away, the wheels squeaking softly against the marble floor. Coleman seethed. The revelation had shaken him to his core. The janitor wasn't a fool. He wasn't a harmless shadow. He was a threat. A threat to Coleman's image, to his ambition, to everything he wanted. And Coleman wasn't going to let an old man, no matter his past, stand in his way. That night, in the dim light of his office, Coleman poured himself a drink and stared at the city skyline. His reflection glared back at him from the glass window. "If they think Hayes is making a comeback," he muttered, "they'll regret it." His grin returned, sharp, dangerous. "The janitor doesn't get the last word. I do." The courthouse stood like a cathedral of stone, its steps crowded with reporters clutching microphones, their breath puffing in the cold morning air. Cameras flashed as lawyers and clients shuffled inside. Henderson versus Baratek wasn't just another case, it was the kind that defined reputations, the kind newspapers dissected for months, the kind careers were built or destroyed upon. And Drew and Coleman Associates were at the center of it all. Coleman walked through the courthouse doors like a conqueror, chin high, tailored suit glinting under the morning light. He smiled for the cameras, shaking hands with clients, his laughter echoing through the marble foyer. His swagger was flawless, but beneath it, sweat prickled at his collar. Walter walked in quietly, unseen. No cameras followed him. No journalists called his name. He carried nothing but his silence and the faint squeak of his old shoes on polished floors. To the world, he was just another custodian who happened to trail behind. But Leah, clutching a stack of briefs, saw him. And when their eyes met, she caught something rare in his steady gaze: resolve. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Rows of polished benches creaked as spectators leaned forward. The plaintiff side, Baratek's lawyers, sat sharp and confident, their briefcases lined like weapons. On the defense table, Coleman straightened his tie and spread out his papers, pretending not to notice his own hand trembling. Drew sat behind him, jaw tight, watching. Leah placed files in neat stacks, her heart pounding. And Walter sat in the very back, his cap pulled low, blending into the shadows. "All rise," the bailiff barked. The judge entered, robes flowing, gavel striking with a crack that silenced the room. "Court is now in session." Coleman opened. His voice, usually dripping with swagger, wavered. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today we will prove that Baratek's negligence," he stumbled, glanced at his notes, cleared his throat. "That Baratek's, mismanagement, led directly to the damages suffered by." He faltered again. A whisper rippled through the gallery. The opposing counsel smirked. Coleman pressed forward, words tumbling over each other, sweat shining on his forehead. His performance was a mess, disorganized, shallow, the kind of opening that didn't inspire confidence, but pity. Drew buried his face in his hand. Leah clenched her notes so tightly the pages wrinkled. The judge's brow furrowed. "Mr. Coleman, are you prepared to continue, or do you need a recess?" Coleman forced a grin. "And no, Your Honor. I'm fine." But he wasn't. The opposition struck like sharks. Their lead attorney rose, sharp-voiced, articulate. She dismantled Coleman's shaky arguments piece by piece, her tone slicing through the air. Jurors leaned in, nodding. The tide was turning, and fast. By mid-morning, it was clear, the defense was floundering. Coleman fumbled exhibits, contradicted himself, and even misquoted a precedent, drawing a correction from the opposing counsel that left the jury snickering. Drew's jaw was set in stone. Leah's stomach churned. And then, from the back, Walter's voice cut through. "That's incorrect." The words were quiet, but they carried. Heads turned. The judge's eyes flicked toward the gallery. Coleman froze. "What? Who said that?" Walter stood, slowly, his shoulders squared. He walked down the aisle, each step steady, deliberate, echoing against the marble. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Who was this man? Why was a janitor interrupting court? The bailiff moved forward, but the judge raised a hand. "Let him speak." Walter stopped at the defense table. His eyes, calm and piercing, settled on the judge. "Your Honor, the opposing counsel misapplied Morgan v. Stateline, 1993. The precedent does not support their claim. It directly contradicts it." A hush fell. The opposing attorney scoffed. "And who exactly are you?" Walter met her gaze. "The man who wrote the brief for that case." Gasps erupted. Drew's eyes widened. Leah's heart leapt. And Coleman looked like he'd swallowed poison. The judge leaned forward, curiosity piqued. "State your name for the record." Walter inhaled slowly. "Walter Edward Hayes." The room froze. Even the court reporter looked up from her keys, stunned. The jurors exchanged bewildered glances. The name rippled through the room like a legend spoken aloud after decades of silence. The judge's stern face softened in recognition. "Hayes. As in, the Hayes. The lion of the courtroom?" Walter inclined his head respectfully. "Once. A long time ago." The murmurs rose to a roar. The bailiff struggled to quiet the crowd. Coleman's face drained of color. The judge nodded. "Very well. Mr. Hayes, you may continue." Walter stepped to the podium. His hands rested on the wood, steady as stone. His voice, deep and deliberate, rolled through the chamber. He didn't need notes. He didn't need theatrics. He spoke with the clarity of memory, with the authority of a man who had lived the law, breathed it, carried it in his bones. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "you've heard half the truth today. But truth is fragile, it must be complete, or it ceases to be truth at all." He walked them through the precedent, weaving logic with story, precision with humanity. He cited statutes by number, dates by memory, details so exact they left the opposition scrambling through their papers. His words painted pictures. He didn't argue like Coleman, loud and shallow. He argued like a craftsman, chiseling away until only truth remained. Jurors leaned forward, spellbound. The judge listened intently, her gavel resting idle. Walter's closing words struck like a hammer. "Justice is not about who shouts the loudest. It is about who remembers what is right. And I remember." The silence that followed was electric. When court adjourned for recess, the room erupted in whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously, phones buzzed with breaking news alerts. Walter Hayes returns, the lion of the courtroom lives. Drew placed a hand on Walter's shoulder, eyes misted. Leah beamed, her chest swelling with pride. Coleman stood frozen, his carefully built image crumbling. His name was no longer on the headlines. Walters was. And in that moment, it was clear, the janitor wasn't invisible anymore. He was unstoppable. The next morning, the courthouse was packed tighter than ever. Reporters lined the marble steps, cameras poised, their voices clashing in a storm of questions. Inside, the gallery overflowed, associates, rival lawyers, even curious citizens who wanted to witness history. The whispers all carried the same name. Walter Hayes. For 2 decades, he had been a ghost. Now he was flesh again. Coleman sat stiffly at the defense table, jaw clenched, sweat darkening his collar. His usual grin was gone. He fumbled with papers he no longer understood, his hands trembling. Every so often he darted glances at Walter, who stood tall at the podium, calm as stone. Walter didn't gloat. He didn't preen. He simply existed with the quiet power of a man who had found his voice again. The opposing counsel rose for her final argument. She was sharp, eloquent, confident. But the damage was already done. Walter had dismantled her claims piece by piece, citing law, precedent, and logic with surgical precision. She tried to patch holes, but her case now looked like a net. The jurors' faces said everything, they weren't convinced. When she finished, Walter stepped forward. He didn't shout. He didn't pace. He simply placed his hands on the podium and spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said softly, his voice carrying to the furthest corners of the chamber, "the law is not a weapon to be bent by arrogance. It is a mirror, meant to reflect the truth. And the truth here is clear, Henderson was wronged. Baratek must be held accountable." He paused, letting the silence sink in. Jurors leaned forward, eyes locked on him. "I ask you not to see me. Not to see a name or a past. See the evidence. See the harm done. See the justice that must be restored." He stepped back. The judge's gavel struck once. "The jury will deliberate." The wait was excruciating. The jury disappeared into the chamber. Hours passed. People whispered, checked their watches, paced the halls. Coleman sat pale and silent, staring at the table as if it might swallow him. Drew kept glancing at Walter, whose face remained serene, his hands folded neatly before him. Leah hovered nearby, her stomach twisted with nerves. Finally, the jury returned. "All rise." The foreman stood, paper trembling in his hands. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Henderson, and against the defendant, Baratek." Gasps filled the room. The verdict echoed like thunder. Baratek had lost. Drew and Coleman's clients had won. But in truth, it wasn't Coleman's victory. It wasn't even Drew's. It was Walter's. Reporters surged forward. Cameras flashed like lightning. Voices clamored. "Walter! Where have you been all these years? Why return now? What do you say to your critics?" Walter raised a hand, silencing them. His voice was steady. "I say this, respect every man, no matter what he wears, no matter what work he does. The law, and life, are not measured by titles, but by truth." The courthouse trembled with applause. Back at the firm, the transformation was immediate. Associates who once laughed at Walter now looked at him with awe. Some whispered apologies as he passed, others simply stared, ashamed of their own blindness. Leah walked beside him proudly, her head high. In the conference room, Drew called a full staff meeting. The air was electric. "Today," Drew began, his voice heavy with emotion, "we witnessed not just a victory for our client, but a rebirth for this firm. For too long, we have allowed arrogance to guide us. For too long, we have forgotten the dignity of the work we do. That ends now." He gestured toward Walter, who stood quietly at his side. "This man, Walter E. Hayes, once saved this firm. And he has saved it again. Effective immediately, Walter is reinstated, not as janitor, not as staff, but as senior counsel. The room erupted in applause. Leah clapped the hardest, tears welling in her eyes. Even seasoned partners stood, offering respect long overdue. Walter lifted a hand, asking for quiet. "I don't need titles," he said. "I don't need applause. But I will accept this if it means we remember, no one in these halls is invisible. Not interns. Not secretaries. Not janitors. Dignity belongs to all." The words struck like gospel. People nodded, some wiping their eyes. And then, there was Coleman. He stood in the back of the room, his face pale, jaw clenched, rage burning beneath the surface. Drew's voice turned cold. "As for you, Coleman, your sabotage, your cruelty, and your arrogance have no place here. You're suspended, effective immediately. And you will answer to the Bar Association for your conduct." Gasps filled the room. Coleman sputtered, "You can't, this is insane. He's just a washed-up." But his words died under the weight of every eye in the room. No one laughed with him now. No one supported him. He was alone. Security escorted him out. His protests echoed down the hall, bitter and hollow. That night, Walter stood in the firm's lobby. The building looked the same, the glass walls, the polished marble, the endless hum of ambition. But the air felt different. Cleaner. Lighter. Leah approached him, clutching a folder. "You could have stayed hidden," she said softly. "Why step back into the fire?" Walter looked at her, his eyes kind. "Because silence is safe," he replied. "But truth is louder." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the city lights flicker through the glass. And for the first time in decades, Walter Hayes felt something he thought he'd lost forever. Home. The days after the verdict blurred into a storm of headlines. Every newspaper carried his name. Every legal blog buzzed with the same story. The Lion returns, Walter Hayes shocks the courtroom. Photographs of him standing at the podium, steady and dignified, spread like wildfire. Reporters clamored for interviews. Former colleagues reached out with astonishment. Even judges from decades past sent letters, their words tinged with awe and gratitude. But Walter slipped quietly back into the rhythm of his life. No press conferences. No victory tours. He arrived at the firm the same way he always had, early, walking through the glass doors with slow steps, a faint smile, and eyes that carried weight. The only difference was the cart. It was gone. Instead, a polished wooden nameplate now waited outside a corner office. Walter E. Hayes, Senior Counsel. The culture of Drew and Coleman began to shift. Slowly at first, then all at once. Associates who once scoffed at interns now paused to listen. Secretaries, long overlooked, found themselves thanked and respected. Even the maintenance crew, who had worked in silence for years, were greeted by name each morning. Walter's story had struck like lightning, illuminating what arrogance had kept hidden, the dignity of every person within those walls. Leah flourished under Walter's quiet mentorship. She followed him like a shadow, soaking up his wisdom not just about the law, but about life. One evening, she asked the question that had been gnawing at her since his revelation. "Why did you come back? After everything? You could have stayed hidden forever." Walter looked at her with gentle eyes. "Because some battles," he said softly, "aren't won for yourself. They're won for the ones watching. For the ones who think they're invisible. For the ones who need to be reminded that silence is not the same as defeat." Leah swallowed hard, her throat tight. In that moment, she realized she wasn't just learning law from Walter. She was learning legacy. Coleman's downfall was swift. The Bar Association launched an inquiry into his conduct. The missing laptop stunt, the falsified reports against Walter, the pattern of cruelty, it all came crashing down on him. His suspension became permanent. His name, once floated in whispers of future partner, was now etched in scandal. He left the city within weeks, his reputation in ruins. Rumors said he tried to start over at a smaller firm out west, but the stain of disgrace clung to him like ink that wouldn't wash out. For a man who had lived on arrogance, obscurity was the harshest punishment of all. One late evening, long after the associates had gone home, Walter sat alone in his new office. The city lights stretched across the skyline, glowing like embers against the dark. On his desk lay two things, the old mop handle, polished smooth by years of use, and a framed photograph of Anna. He touched the mop handle gently, as if acknowledging the years he had spent in silence. Then his fingers rested on the photograph, tracing the curve of her smile. "I found my reason, Anna," he whispered. "Just like you asked." The office was still, but he swore he could feel her presence, a warmth, a quiet approval. Weeks later, Walter returned to the courtroom, this time not for Henderson, but for a pro bono case. A young single mother, crushed by an unjust eviction, stood trembling before the judge. Her voice wavered, her eyes filled with fear. Walter stood beside her, steady and calm. He spoke with the same precision, the same humanity, the same unshakable strength that had once earned him the title of Lion. And when the verdict came in her favor, the tears that streamed down her face were thanks enough. It wasn't about glory. It wasn't about headlines. It was about what Anna had always told him: justice is not about winning, but about restoring what was lost. On his final walk through the firm one evening, Walter passed by a young janitor, mop in hand, headphones in his ears. The boy barely looked up. Walter paused, smiled, and said, "You're doing good work." The boy blinked, surprised. Then he smiled back, shy but grateful. Walter kept walking, but inside, something settled. Full circle. In the months that followed, Drew and Coleman officially changed its motto, etched into the stone wall of the lobby for all to see. No one is invisible. Every client, every employee, every intern who walked through those doors read those words. And they knew whose legacy it honored. On a quiet Sunday morning, Walter sat on a park bench overlooking the river. Leah joined him, carrying 2 coffees. She handed him one and asked, "Do you ever wish things had been different?" Walter sipped slowly, his eyes fixed on the water. "No," he said at last. "I lost years. I lost Anna. But I also gained something. The silence taught me patience. The mop taught me humility. And the trial reminded me of who I was. If I had never fallen, maybe I would have never learned how to rise again." Leah nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Then what now?" she asked. Walter smiled faintly. "Now, I teach. And when my time is done, the story won't be about the man who disappeared. It'll be about the man who came back." The wind carried his words across the water. And somewhere, beyond the reach of time, Anna smiled. Walter Hayes, the man once forgotten, once invisible, was invisible no longer. His name lived not just in case law, not just in verdicts, but in the people he touched, the dignity he restored, and the legacy he left behind. Because justice is not just about the powerful. It is about remembering the worth of those the world forgets. And Walter Hayes would never be forgotten again.